Hello and welcome to Embodiment During Existential Risk. We're going to be covering a lot of heady, dense topics here, one slide at a time and two 30-second clips. You can pause it if you'd like so you can really get the full impact of visual. It's going to be some climate models at first. That's going to be the first section, just looking at the latest climate forecasts. And then we're going to get into an interesting detour on UFOs and then round it out with how to respond to all of what I've shared with embodiment and contemplative practices and trying to gather up the tools to get you adequately prepared for what we have in store for the next 20 years. Basically, the appropriate course of action or way in which to respond to this existential risk. So those are the three sections. We're going to start off here with climate forecasts. This first one is where it really got me woken up. This is the smelling salts for me about a month ago. People are probably familiar with this really hot July that we had that broke a lot of climate records. The interesting aspect here is the temperature anomaly in the North Atlantic, that really dense hot spot there in the top middle, right off the coast of British Columbia, is totally out of hand for out of hand standards. They thought maybe the temperature recorders were broken or maybe the Gulf Stream was broken. And so they're still kind of scratching their heads on that. A better way to visualize that is here. All those little squiggly blue lines from the bottom to the top are progressive years of the temperature recordings throughout that year. You can see along the bottom, January all the way to December. And so you can even see some other colored lines, the pink, the yellow, and the green. Those are 2020, 2021, 2022. And so you can see the fluctuations in the temperatures of the North Atlantic. This year is red, and again, it's like totally out of hand. It's very strange. So it appears that we're reaching certain tipping points. And this isn't even half of it. A few days later, it looked like this. They had to extend the chart now to 1.5, which they hadn't actually needed to add to the chart because they never thought temperatures would get that high. It gets a little worse a few days later, and this is a more embodied look at the big picture of these temperature fluctuations throughout the year, particularly looking at the North Atlantic. And obviously there are a lot of causal factors involved here, but this is highly concerning. They actually recorded 101 degrees Fahrenheit off the coast of Florida only about a week or two ago, which is the temperature of a hot tub. It's just doesn't make any sense. And so they're still kind of grappling with that. But here is another scary aspect while we're on the topic is the Antarctica sea ice has declined by over 2 million square kilometers just in the last year. It's the same with the squiggles. You can actually see the fluctuating sea ice where it'll gain ice and lose ice throughout the year. And this year we've lost so much that we're not even going to be able to replenish what we've lost. 2 million square kilometers is out of hand. And so continuing on, it appears that we've got something of a step function where, as you can see with this green line that plots out the temperature increases over the last century, from 1920 to 2020, there have been these little step function boosts, starting with around 1970, 1980, from pre-industrial area to current. You can see these little step functions. And so it appears, if you look in the very top right here, we're on another step function. And so it's actually been said by many climate scientists that this year is going to be a cool year compared to the next decade. So we're kind of into new territory. Here's an even bigger zoom out beyond just this past century. This is the last 22,000 years, and that gray rectangle is the temperature range during all of human civilization. And we're thinking maybe human civilization might extend beyond that, but that's really just looking at the last 10,000 years or so. And so if you can see the range in which the temperature is understandably fluctuating, we are currently already well beyond that, as you see that first "you are here" dot, and we're on track to go well beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. And it seems that there's no stopping us from getting to 2 degrees Celsius warming. And the fact that there's any consideration of 3 degrees Celsius warming shows just how insane things have gotten in such a short amount of time. Next, just to keep this into context, there have been times in which the temperature of the planet has increased quite significantly, but it's been over long periods of time, over about 12,000 years for the previous two deglaciations. So deglaciations are where the global temperature has gone up, but again, it's gone up gradually. The red is us, and we've gone up beyond that in a fraction of the time. A fraction, I mean like 1% of the time. And so this is just really seeing how severe it actually is instead of just saying, oh yeah, climate change. So A lot of this is all taken from the Busy Worker's Handbook to the Apocalypse. It's a Medium article put together by Sam Hall, who's an independent climate researcher and who has a phenomenal treasure trove of climate data and models. It's an exceptionally well-cited and well-substantiated read, and it has some pretty dire conclusions. I've been sending it off to climate fact checkers, and there have been a few details, sure, that he's kind of getting misaligned, but it's not impacting the ultimate conclusion is that given these hockey stick exponential curves, the conclusion of this article, which you can find, again, a treasure trove of climate data that is all well cited in footnotes so you can take it to its original source. The conclusion of this article is that climate change will cause agricultural failure and subsequent collapse of hyperfragile modern civilization, likely within the next 10 to 15 years. By 2050, total human population will likely be under 2 billion. Humans, along with most other animals, will be extinct before the end of the century. These impacts are locked in and cannot be reverted. Everything in this article is supporting information for this conclusion, and he does a hell of a job at doing that. And so I would highly encourage anybody to take a look at this, because I understand that a little bit of doom and gloom alarmism doesn't feel very good, but in my opinion, it's good to know the conceivable forecast for the near future, because if you want to actually apply yourself to doing civic effort, let's say in a seaside town where you found out that a tsunami is about to arrive in about 6 hours. Well, it doesn't make sense to do systemic change at that point if the town's not going to be there. And so we have to tailor our civic actions given the forecast that we have ahead of us. If you're on the Titanic and we've just hit the iceberg, it would be silly to try to keep the ship from not sinking. It's going to sink. The best case scenario for that situation on the Titanic is to save as many people as possible and apply care and get as many people to life rafts and try to coordinate efforts with other civic actions. Understanding that you've got about 6 hours to deal with and trying to tee things up so that you save as much human life as possible and mitigate suffering. That's always the MO. And so this is kind of where I'm getting at with this. What I want to move on to, though, which is a kind of an interesting detour, I mentioned UFOs, is given the severity of this, it seems to me that one way of categorizing the proper response or course of action is to really liken ourselves to hospice workers for a dying civilization, which is still a very noble and honorable pursuit. It's mitigating suffering, understanding that even with these terrible outlooks, there are better and worse ways in which it goes. You can try to tool people up so that they can navigate these hardships in the best way, all things considered. They can kind of mitigate the amount of suffering they would otherwise have to go to, and maybe jump off into other eco-villages, intentional living communities, because as things begin to collapse, starting with agriculture collapse and supply chain collapse, that's kind of what's going to be happening. So biting that is going to be something that comes in later. So moving on to UFOs, I'm going to play a 30-second clip that if you haven't seen it, you really should. It kind of just shows just how credible this UFO phenomenon has become. And then we'll get into that congressional hearing from a couple of weeks ago. But I think this is an excellent place to start because it's some of the better footage that exists currently on the UFO phenomenon.
Look at this thing. It's rotating. Oh my gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude.
You can sort of hear the surprise in their voices.
You certainly can. They seem to have broke character a bit. And we're just kind of amazed at what they were seeing.
What do you think when you see something like this?
This is a difficult one to explain. You have rotation, you have high altitudes, you have propulsion, right? I don't know. I don't know what it is, frankly.
So there you have it. And you can actually now see that same individual that was speaking there, he's bald now, at the congressional hearing from 2 weeks ago on UAP findings. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. If you know anything about David Fravor, who actually recorded one of those footages off the coast of San Diego back in 2004, only came to light a couple of years ago with that New York Times article, David Grush in the middle is talking not only about seeing these UAPs on a regular basis, but that there are good reasons to suspect that parts of our intelligence agencies have been in communication with some of these intelligent, called NHI civilizations. NHI is non-human intelligence. And that there's reasons to suspect that parts of our intelligence agencies actually have in their possession craft that have been recovered that came with biologics, non-human intelligent biologics. And so I know this is a lot to take in. I'm not particularly a UFO guy, but as you look carefully at this and kind of parse out the fact from the fiction, there's a whole lot here. There's a whole lot of interesting material. And so what I want to get at is now some of the most credible groups, individuals of the bunch, because there's a lot to sift through. So here are some particularly interestingly credible sources just within the last couple of years that have come forward that are talking a very similar narrative as what David Grush is in that where there's actually some communication and correspondence going on behind the scenes with some of these intelligent NHI civilizations. First is Haim Eshed, retired Israeli general of, I think it's the space agency in Israel. He came out just a couple of years ago talking about how that has been an ongoing thing, that the intelligence agencies are communicating with these intelligent civilizations. And then next is Paul Hellyer, who is the former Canadian defense minister. He's one of the highest ranking individuals ever to come forward from the G8 and basically disclosed that, yes, the intelligence agency has been talking with these guys for a long time and things are ramping up. The disclosure is being disseminated and there's good reason for that, actually. It's not an accident. Next is John Ramirez, who's a former CIA agent that takes it even further, if you can believe it, and that not only are we having communication with these extraterrestrial entities or non-human entities, but that we've been given a deadline in terms of intervention, where it makes sense to me in some regard that if we were to find intelligent life on Mars per se, we'd spy on them with drones, probably not intervene, just kind of gauge them and observe them. Not that different than what they do in Star Trek with the Prime Directive and not actually get involved, but that maybe what would get you to get involved is if the civilization you're spying on is about to destroy its biosphere and that planet's not going to be able to sustain life in 100 years. And so literally from John Ramirez, as well as, even though it's kind of a completely different source, Daryl Anka, a Bashar channeler, who, give it a look. I'm not much of an into channeling. I know a little bit of Law of One and those raw channelings back in the 1960s. This guy seems like, comparatively speaking, a fairly credible source. He's actually gotten a lot of things eerily correct over the years, starting with 9/11 and COVID in 2020. And so if you pay attention to him and engage him, he's been saying this very similar material for 30, 40 years. This is not a new thing. It doesn't appear to be a grifter that's just come out the woodworks. And so if you gauge all of these very disparate sources that are not aware of each other, they're saying a very similar language. And the bottom two, again, John Ramirez and Daryl Anka, have said that 2027 is anticipating a contact event from some of these intelligent civilizations that are going to intervene and try to save us from destroying our biosphere. So John Ramirez has said this. I'll link to that in the description. And then Daryl Anka has given this as a channeling prediction from Bashar, that as well as the end of 2026, beginning of 2027, we can expect some kind of contact event from a non-human intelligence. And so make of that what you will. I know we're getting into crazy territory, but I try to watch everything. I treat my mind like a lobby. I just want to bide what's out there and sift through the fact and fiction and see if we are bound to be a hospice worker for dying civilization. What is, when given a lot of rope, a possibility that we do avert disaster? Well, aliens. Okay, so that's what we're getting at, is with possible alien intervention. Now to embodiment. To try to wrap all of this up, I told you there's those three sections. We looked at the climate forecast models, the possibility of an alien intervention in 2027. And now, however things go, I think the proper course of response to this is, again, like being on the Titanic, where you see we're about to hit this iceberg, doing that mental calculus of I got 6 hours to work with, and there are better and worse ways in which this plays out. I have an opportunity to apply myself to this interesting game theoretic situation, learn what I can, mitigate suffering where I can, and plot the most appropriate course of action to save as many people, knowing that, in my opinion, knowing that things ultimately end anyway, whether it's this century or 100 centuries from now, the operative protocol isn't hinging any of your efforts to some finish line. Like, what do we just want to survive this century and get to the next one? How far do we want it to go? These aren't trivial, frivolous questions. I think it changes the calculus, if you're following along with me, hopefully, to one of, I find myself in this century with these types of game theoretic dynamics. Maybe it's a power symmetry or some type of multipolar trap, some kind of game theoretic situation, and say, okay, what role would I like to play in this? I could play no role, but that sets a dangerous precedent. Now you play no role in situations like this, and eventually that will bite you in the ass. Or you play some role and try to operate conducively with the other civic actors in the space to tee up the best possible outcome, all things considered. That's all one can do. And to me, that's getting good at existing if you've got no choice but to exist. I go back to this Groundhog Day analogy all the time, which I should have a slide for, but in Groundhog Day, it seems very apparent that this Bill Murray character, who starts off very selfish and self-absorbed, when forced to repeat the day and is bound to an infinite existence, finds that's not a fulfilling way to operate and starts to get good at existing in such a way that actually leads to fulfillment and happiness by being a good steward of his community, learning piano, helping the homeless guy, not trying to sleep with every girl that he talks to, and just being a very omnipositive part of his community, which to me is always the end all be all. No matter what the end outlook is, really, it's what's the nature of the situation, how can I apply myself to it in order to learn what I can learn. So next on is, given that we have this global planet that is at risk of losing its biosphere, plotting it out, would you have to plot out the whole thing instead of just kind of just picking tiny little local actions? Because what's the point if you're going to save something and then you lose the whole? If you take into the whole account, one trend that I'm seeing that I think you can hold and try to add momentum to and add some fuel to it and kind of gauge it and hold it is this movement out of the large metropolitan centers into smaller eco-villages and intentional living communities. There is a statistical trend for this, mostly based off of the cost of living in these major metropolitan cities, the ability to work remotely. And so you can see this moving inwards from the coasts into smaller communities, everything from, again, eco-villages to communes to I'm living at the Monastic Academy currently, Maple, which is an example of one. And so I think holding that and protecting them so that as that increases, they don't get overwhelmed by that influx, because should we be able to survive the next 50 years and we don't lose the biosphere, I do think it's these small little disparate communities that would come out of the ashes at the end of all of this when the dust settles and rebuild. And so these are the kinds of planning that I think needs to go into this, as well as, of course, being available for people as kind of hospice workers to a dying civilization to mitigate that suffering and give people the tools to have in their toolkit so that they can navigate appropriately over the next 20, 30 years. And again, using this as an analogy of looking at the entire body, not one at the expense of the others, but looking at the heart, lungs, kidneys, nervous system, cardiovascular system, because you have to take it all into account. And by that, I mean looking at the social media sphere, looking at the education space, looking at community development groups, environmental action groups, government reform groups, educational reform groups. Everything under the sun is going to play some role in here, including YouTubers and content creators. This is the public consciousness. This is the culture work that would need to be done to try to deal with these things as upstream as it makes sense to go. And so when you go upstream to a lot of these problems that have brought us to where we are now, it's really an erroneous societal sense-making. It's very imbalanced fragmentation of consciousness that has led to this, where we're very livingly disembodied. We're operating to benefit our own well-being at the expense or even just independent of others, which causes these causal loops that come full circle and harm ourselves. And so changing that for people, I think, is well worth it. I have this acronym that I go back to all the time, that better educating people on the nature of reality and their relationship to reality will always be a worthwhile endeavor, irregardless of what existential crisis you find yourself in. Because we are the product of other people's choices to some extent, the choices of our parents and stewards and mentors, as well as we then are informing the sense-making journeys of others. Others are the product of our choices to some extent. So looking up this Ubuntu of I am because we are, and recognizing the responsibility that you have, being someone that does have a better handle on things and is in a place to be able to distribute that effectively so that other people have a better understanding of the nature of their reality and their relationship to reality and how to appropriately act, seems to be the MO here. So moving on, something to consider here, I think, that is well worth understanding. A common criticism is, well, if you can't tie it up with a bow and dot your I's and cross your T's and be able to tell in 100% of what a person should or shouldn't do, then you're no business to be an arbiter of truth. I completely agree. I completely agree to a certain extent. Guess what? Arbiters of truth don't exist. It's not a thing. It's not a thing. It's kind of absurd to think that there would be. There's always the possibility of new evidence, so all you can do is the most responsible job that you can do, given what you're aware of. As long as there's the possibility of new evidence, that's all you're ever going to be able to do. And so there is a distribution, though, of people that have a better understanding of reality than others. Doesn't put them in a position to be an arbiter of it, but it does put them in the most appropriate position to be able to disseminate it. And so basically what I'm saying is that you can point in the right direction without having to know to a fine T the nature of the destination. So put simply, you don't have to know the destination to point people in the right direction. in terms of just basic critical thinking skills, basic interpersonal skills, contemplative skills, somatic ability, being able to work collaboratively with others, how to be omnipositive, how to understand how to navigate rivalrous dynamics. These things are part and parcel with a better understanding of how to navigate your reality in your situation. These things can be distributed and ought to be distributed in a good faith dialogue sort of way, in a conducive way, so that people have the tools in their repertoire to be able to navigate this appropriately. And this is like dropping breadcrumbs, really. You can think of it as dropping breadcrumbs in someone's path tailored to them that they might be receptive to, that is going to give them tools to be able to operate conducively. It's like leading a horse to water by dropping breadcrumbs. No, not leading a horse to water, but dropping breadcrumbs on that horse's path that horse has a high likelihood of being receptive to, that spurs the curiosity of the horse to want to find the water for himself. Okay, does that track? There are plenty of actions that people have tried to try to convince people of certain things. They never really work. All that has ever worked, statistically speaking, when you look at what does work, you can look at the likes of David McRaney and How Minds Change, is when a good faith dialogue relationship is fostered, and you can kind of meet them where they are and not presuppose any particular conclusions, emphasize how to think, not what to think, and just find different opportunities to what extent that you have an understanding of where they're at that might be receptive to them. Maybe their soft spot is game theory, or maybe it's meditation or contemplative practices or critical thinking skills. What do they have soft spots for that might be a way to vector their sense making in a positive direction to some extent? I think this is what has to be considered. This is going upstream. And again, whether or not our civilization ends or not is kind of beside the point, is what I'm saying. It's always in our best interest to be better stewards of the sense making of our community. And I think there are ways in which you can do that that are better than others. You can work down the risks of doing that. Here's a clip to show you what embodied conversation may look like. This is what I want to kind of tee up and offer. And I'm going to be putting work into trying to do this because I think it's best to lead by example. And so this is just a 30-second example of a somatic dialogue on existential risk. It's just a small little example. I'm going to link the entire conversation in the description. But I think dispersing more conversations like this is one of the best ways to distribute better sense making. That's why the podcast space has gotten so big, because you can feel like you're in the room and it actually feels like a good faith dialogue, even though you're not actually in person talking with the individuals. And so what I would like to be sussing out here is having in-person and Zoom style long form conversations on existential risk, contemplative practices, community development, rivalrous dynamics, game theory, the whole gamut, whatever someone is interested, and then trying to fine tune it in a way that it's as useful to people and they can acquire it and put it into their toolkit, as well as even pushing the envelope on what's the best course of action given the nature of our existential crisis right now. What do we have available to us? Is it hospice work? Is it aliens? Is it maybe, getting those superconductors going and solving the nuclear fusion equation, or getting AI to figure out carbon capture technology? Like, there are possible other variables that maybe we can suss out and find the most appropriate course of action to lead to a better future for us. All right. So I'm going to play this clip. Like I said, that it is a good example of an embodied dialogue, which is what I'm wanting to foster as a means for dispersing the somatic practice of embodied dialogue.
A lot of people have a felt sense that things are starting to break down. Do you sympathize with that, and how would you sort of sum up what that means?
If we look at the history of the thing we call civilization to date, one very obvious thing that we notice is that all the early civilizations don't still exist.
All right. So that's what I want to leave you with. That, to me, is the solution angle that I'm going to be taking, is trying to disperse these more felt, embodied dialogues on serious issues so that people get a frame of reference and an example for how to understand these things, how to embody, how to incorporate them, how to respond to them, how to engage with it in a useful, productive way, and how to understand the dynamics to such an extent as to be able to navigate them appropriately. And so wanted to finish off with a funny little visual. This is one of my favorite ones of all time. It's cats dressed as hobbits. The reason I wanted to end on some levity is I do think that irregardless of the extent of the severity of the existential crisis, counterintuitively, operating with levity and almost playfulness, you're going to be more effective, actually. This is true in sports. Whenever you ask guys like Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, whenever they would hit those game-winning high-tension shots, they often would say that it's when they treated it like a backyard game of basketball with their brother that they would hit it. If they treat it like a high tension situation, they would fall under pressure and miss. Same thing with actors in Hollywood. Whenever they would go to an audition and treat it like some hyper serious high tension thing, they would ruin the audition. If they went to it not caring if they got it or not and treated it like an acting exercise, they did better. And so I know it's very difficult to do with something like this where there's a lot at stake, a lot of lives and suffering at stake. To be effective at this, I think we actually should have some levity. And so I know that's a lot of complex philosophical work for a picture of cats in hobbit suits, but I spend a little bit of time looking at cats on the internet every day. I feel like that kind of gives me a little bit of fun and levity, and I think it's actually an important aspect in all of this. And so there you have it. That's my presentation on embodiment and potential pathways forward out of this existential crisis we find ourselves in. So thank you very much for watching, and reach out anytime. I'm always available for a Zoom. You can reach me at ben@goodsensemaking.com or find my information in the description. Thank you very much. Much love.